Hey there, welcome back to the channel. This is going to be a video about tone. It's going to be 5 quick tips on bass tone. Number 1, intonation on fretted instruments. So people who play fretless instruments know how important intonation is. If you're not dead on, you produce the wrong pitch. But on fretted instruments, intonation is a great thing to focus on when you're trying to improve your overall tone and the overall tightness of your playing. What having this type of perfect intonation does is it allows the string to be anchored perfectly behind the fret. If you're a little bit farther away, your finger is not gripping it as tight, and the vibrating part of the string goes across the fret slightly. Now obviously that can produce buzz, but it can also limit your dynamic range when you're digging a little bit harder. It can make your playing sound a little bit more inconsistent and just overall doesn't produce as clear of a pitch as when you're perfectly anchored right behind the fret. Tip number 2, be careful with mids. Now, oftentimes a problem playing the bass in a room with other people is that we can't hear ourselves very clearly. So one tip that a lot of people pick up is, well, if I boost my mids, I'll be a little bit more articulate. My attack will come through and I'll be able to hear myself a little bit better. This is absolutely true. And on many of these videos that I produce here on YouTube, one adjustment I make in Logic is to actually boost the mids. So I'll boost between 300 and 500, and it allows the bass to be heard on lower quality speakers, such as a laptop or an iPhone. So boosting mids does work. It allows your bass to sound a little bit more articulate. The problem is that when you're playing at a loud volume, what the mids do is provide more punch, and it makes your bass appear much louder. So it doesn't just make you more articulate, it can be a little bit abrasive to the ear because the mids are sort of punching through and giving the perception that the bass is screaming loud. So instead of turning up your mid knob on your amp or turning up your mid knob on your active bass, try to get more articulation without touching your tone. Some ways that you can do that is playing closer to the bridge, playing with better intonation, as I said, playing a little bit harder and more dynamically. These are good first steps to do before touching your mids. Okay, so tip number 3, strings matter. There are really just 3 types of strings. There are flat wounds, there are heavy gauge round wounds, and there are light gauge round wounds. Each of these types of strings produce very different results. If the sound calls for flat wounds, you can approximate it by using round wounds and doing some palm muting or perhaps changing your tone, but there's no substitute for the real deal. It really changes the way you play when you play flats. It requires you to think a little bit differently about what types of things are available to you, what types of techniques and articulations sound good. Many of the things that sound good on round wounds don't sound good on flat wounds. One more quick tip on strings. Many players are afraid of heavy gauge round wounds, or heavy gauge flat wounds for that matter. My advice is if you've been playing for a little while and you're resistant to trying heavier gauge flat wounds or round wounds because you think that they'll slow you down or that you won't be able to, use all of your technique and everything that you've practiced because they're a little bit harder to play, my advice is try them. You might be surprised at just how much of your technique translates to it. Furthermore, you might be very impressed with how good heavy gauge round wounds sound. You don't have to go nuts, but using a heavy or mid-heavy round wound can make a really big difference, especially on P basses and jazz basses. Okay, so tone tip number 4. Passive basses can sound better when they're played harder. So this one is a bit subjective, but it's my opinion that passive basses behave a little bit more like acoustic instruments than, say, electric guitars played through very loud amplifiers or active basses. On a passive bass like a P bass, the tone changes based on how hard you play. So of course on any instrument, if you're playing so hard that the strings are slapping against the frets, that's going to be a different tone. But oftentimes on active basses, the sound almost gets squashed, kind of like a compressor, because you have the ability to artificially boost things like some of these lesser heard frequencies in the overall spectrum, such as highs and mids, they get sort of flattened out and boosted by active electronics. That's kind of what an active preamp does, is it allows you to boost some of these other frequencies. A passive bass, however, produces a sound that more naturally resembles the sound of a vibrating string, much like an acoustic guitar. With an acoustic guitar, the idea is to build an instrument that produces the most pure, beautiful, resonant sound of a vibrating string. It's the same thing with a passive bass. So I find that if you play with slightly higher action, or perhaps heavy gauge strings like flat wounds or heavy round wounds, you can dig a little bit harder and pull more tone out of your P bass. They can sound better when they have a wider dynamic range and you're not fretting out as you're plucking. Okay, so you can dig a little bit harder without fretting out. Okay, so tip number 5, set your EQ flat. So what I mean by flat is every knob on your amp is not boosting or cutting. It's just representing what's coming out of your instrument. This is really important. It's important to start with your EQ flat and adjust based on the other instruments, based on where your bass sits in the mix, and most importantly, based on the room. So you'll find sometimes that your amp will sound different in different rooms. Maybe in your practice room with your band, your bass amp sounds very boomy, but at home it sounds crystal clear and you can hear every part of your playing. The room changes what your bass sounds like. So because of that, it's important to resist the urge to think about EQ as, well, I like my bass to sound this way, so I'll set my EQ the same way every time. Instead, set your EQ flat, have the tone in your head, and listen and adjust to get to your desired tone, but starting from 0. So that's it. I hope that this video was useful for you. If it was, please like and subscribe and leave a comment and let me know what you think. And I'll see you in the next one. Thanks a lot.